going to have a fabulous research panel for you today, and as you've seen on the schedule, we have a panel today and tomorrow and the next day. One of our panelists is not here yet, so don't be alarmed if Jan comes running in and comes to take her seat. Hopefully she will be here. And I also wanted to say I put myself on the panel for today to share my research with you. Depending on our time and how things are going, I may just say let's go ahead and do Q&A because I'll be with you all week long. You will have lots of opportunities to hear about my research, and so we can fill that in, so don't be alarmed if we don't do all 7 of us. I wanted to tell you what we're going to do is each of these fantastic folks are going to take 5 minutes to tell you a bit about their research. All of them are going to be focusing on different things, and I think this really gets to one of the questions you were asking about just the breadth of the work that we do, and I think you'll see that when we talk about health research, we're talking about a huge range of things and across a number of disciplines. So I won't say any more, but what I'd like to do is have our panelists just briefly introduce themselves, and then we'll start with, oh, come on, Dan. I was just talking about Jan Dunham. Thank you. Yeah, no worries. We're running late too. And so I'll have them each just quickly introduce themselves, tell you just, who they are, what their role is, and then we'll start with Josiah. Great. So you want to start, Clara?
I'm Clara Stratton. I'm a double major here at PSU, biology and psychology with a focus on neuroscience. I did my first 2 years of school at Portland Community College before transferring.
Aloha Kapko. Good morning, everyone. My name is Alma Trinidad. I'm a professor here at the School of Social Work. I'm also in a joint appointment with University Studies, which is our general education program here at Portland State University. Welcome.
Hi, I'm Sam Wagner. I am out of the PSU Biology Department. I'm a 5th-year PhD candidate. I'm finishing up in July.
I'm Greg Townley, assistant professor in psychology. I'm trained as a clinical community psychologist, and I'll talk a little bit more about that when I speak. Thanks.
I'm Perth O'Brien. I'm a colleague of Greg's in the psychology department. I'm a social psychologist.
I'm Jan Kuhn-Heinemann. I'm an assistant professor at OHSU. I'm in public health. I'm an epidemiologist and focus on obesity and prevention.
Excellent. Great. Well, Josiah, you want to go ahead?
All right, so I'll try and keep this to 30 minutes. So my name is Josiah Wagner. I'm a PhD candidate out of the biology department. So for those of you who don't know about how PhDs work, that means I've passed all my comprehensive exams, and basically I just need to turn in my thesis, and then I can hopefully get this doctorate. So I study a killifish out of Venezuela, and they're pretty neat because they live in these temporary environments that desiccate every year. So all the adult fish die, so there's an adult fish over there. All the adult fish die because most fish need water. And their embryos actually can dry out in the mud, and they live there without oxygen and without water for months or years. And then when the rain comes back, they continue developing and hatch, and that's how the life cycle continues. So the way that they do that is they have these special stages of development called diapause, which is a preemptive attempt to build up stress tolerance against these bad conditions, basically. And the most stress-resistant stage is diapause 2 right there, without midway into development. And that's where they might spend the majority of their life, is stopping development in this mud. So they have this really great stress tolerance ability, so they can tolerate DNA damage, anoxia, which is no oxygen, desiccation, lack of water, salinity extremes, so salty, not salty, and temperature fluctuations. And so what we do in the Pratt Strasky lab is we use microscopy, molecular biology, embryology techniques, genomics, and physiology and functional genomics to try and figure out how do they do that, because anoxia tolerance is really interesting for human health, because what happens when you have a heart attack or you have a stroke, it's cut off oxygen to those vital organs, and we want to know how do they live for months without oxygen. So it's one of the essential questions that we look at. Me in particular, I look at DNA damage, because when they're dormant in this diapause stage, they might not be actively repairing their DNA. So if you can imagine from intro bio, right, you need DNA to be readable in order to express the genes. So what I did was, one of the experiments is that we shoot these things with ultraviolet radiation, right? So ultraviolet radiation is really bad. comes from the sun, and it causes DNA damage. And what's interesting is that when they're in diapause, they don't appear to repair their DNA unless you give them something called photoreactivating light. So a lot of organisms, not humans unfortunately, have this special enzyme called photolyase, which can bind to the DNA damage, and it takes a photon of light and is able to catalyze the reversal of that DNA damage. So one piece of DNA damage binds to one photolyase enzyme, it takes one photon of light, reverses it. So it's really fascinating mechanism. And so if you give them light, even when they're in diapause, they're able to repair DNA damage. So they appear to repair the DNA damage before they come out of diapause. And what's really interesting is that these guys can repair a lot of DNA damage, even more, and they can tolerate more than many other species. So you can see here, this is a log plot of me irradiating them. This is other species. So they always come to the top of their tolerance. So here's a little bit about me. So I got my BS in biology, I minored in English. I tried to double major, and that was a mistake, so not doing that. And so I just got a minor in English. Thank you, film classes. And so I'm a PhD candidate, PhD bio, like I said. I was a McNair Scholar, so I don't know if you guys are familiar with that program. If you're interested in that, you can talk to me about that. I would love to talk about that. I don't know if that makes us competitors, McNair versus EXITO, but cross that bridge. So I've authored 2 first author pubs in the past year. If you're interested in the peer review process, I can talk to you about that. I could also talk to you about conferences, posters, and presentations. I'm familiar with that as well. Because publications, conferences, that's the core of science. That's how we should grow science. So I have experience with mentoring LSAMP undergraduates. You can ask me what do we expect of these guys. I was on the McNair selection committee 3 times, so if you want to know what they're interested in and what can make you a strong candidate, let me know. Promotion tenure committee 1 time. If you're interested in going to academics and want to be a professor, I can tell you what they want. And I TA for various classes. And I also have a lot of knowledge of most of the bio faculty, either directly or indirectly. If you're interested in working with someone in particular, I could talk to you about that. I know who's good to work with, who's not good to work with. And most importantly, how to talk to these people, because a lot of you may or may not be scared of professors, and they are scary, but a lot of them, you just gotta know how to talk to them and get into labs quite easily. So I look forward to hearing questions.
Excellent. So it sounds like Josiah has no good information for you at all, right? No, this is the guy, apparently. Clara, which presentation you want me to open?
The SIBS poster first.
And then you see where the other one is, right there. I'll let you open that one.
So I'm Clara Stratton. Like I mentioned, I am a double major here at PSU, biology and psychology with a focus on neuroscience. When I first started at PCC 3 years ago, I was really just hoping to get through my first 2 years and see whether I made it. And so I was a little unprepared to be roped in immediately to the Bridges to Baccalaureate internship program, which I kind of applied to spur of the moment, not having any idea what I was doing in my very first term. So I ended up being placed in the SIBS project, which is supporting siblings in foster care. Essentially, a research project looking at the difference in outcome between siblings that were placed in foster care without any additional support to help them maintain their sibling relationships versus those who had additional support to maintain their sibling relationships. So I was doing assessments, baseline assessments, and then every 6-month follow-up assessments of these siblings in both groups. And after I'd been there for a couple of months, I started doing coaching. I actually, even though this was not in neuroscience, and I initially was like, what? This is social work. That's not what I'm doing. It was such an amazing experience and so informative and developmental for me that I continued on for another 9 months as a volunteer after the internship ended. I realized during the course of this internship that this research experience, even though it wasn't specific to my field of interest, was invaluable in developing my identity as a researcher and understanding how to interact with mentors, how to conduct research of any kind, and also in how to move forward in my pursuit, my academic pursuit towards eventually going to graduate school. So that was my first research experience, and Dawn, I don't really understand how to use this. I'm sorry. This doesn't. So after that very rewarding experience, my first time around with Bridges, I reapplied the following year and ended up being placed with Dr. Lauren Frank, who does work in the communications department here at PSU. And she was looking into basically public perception of the HPV vaccine and comparison of how people responded, especially people in Hispanic groups, has responded to the HPV vaccine information presented in a narrative form versus that presented in a more traditional, white coat, bullet points of information kind of format. And the piece of her research that I worked on was really just designing and interpreting a preliminary survey that was conducted online using some software called Mechanical Turk through Amazon that allows people to crowdsource surveys like this. So the information that I got, while preliminary, was really interesting and helped to inform the direction of the rest of her research project. Basically just looking at the difference in perception or what people thought about the HPV vaccine, how effective it is, and what their own risk is. And we found that people really grossly underestimated their own risk, even though they did believe that the vaccine is very effective at preventing HPV and cancer. So that was an interesting piece of information to move forward with. I think that's just about it.
Great, thank you, Claire.
Hi, I'm Kirk O'Brien. I'm a social psychologist, and I don't have slides. I'm here to talk with you a little bit, though, about my work. I study social psychological aspects of health situations. So I've looked at a lot of different situations in which people are perhaps at risk for a health problem. I've done a lot of HIV prevention work, or maybe responding to a health problem. I have a project going on now that I'll tell you a little bit more about, in which we asked patients about their experiences with their doctors. And this area of looking at people's relationships with their healthcare providers is something that I've been sort of moving into to look at in more depth. And so I thought it might be helpful if I said a little bit about why would somebody study a topic like that? There are several reasons. One is we're really interested in what we sort of broadly call disparities in healthcare and the experiences that people of different racial or ethnic backgrounds have in the healthcare system. So one thing we know, for instance, is that African Americans, according to the data we have so far, are less likely to ask questions of their doctors in the doctor's office than are, for example, European Americans. Well, you have that finding, but then what does that mean? Does that mean that people just need to know how to ask questions? Or actually, that would probably not be my perspective on it. My perspective would probably be, let's understand what led to that kind of chilly interaction in which people don't feel like they can ask questions. That might be an angle that one might take. Well, before you can really know what angle to take, you need to hear more from the people who are in those situations, right? So that's definitely an approach we have. So one aspect of why patient and provider relationships matter is because of these disparities. Another reason why patient and provider relationships matter is because healthcare is a major social institution, right? So it's kind of like the government or like some other major, religious institutions or something. If you're not engaging effectively with healthcare, then you're not engaging effectively with a big part of how our society is organized. So it makes sense to understand what's going on for that reason also. And then also, providers provide, they've got expertise, they've got access to tests, they've got access to procedures, they have expertise themselves, but then they're also gatekeepers to further providers and to further care. So providers have something that patients need, and so the relationship matters for that reason too. Last but not least, when somebody is ill, that's a very vulnerable, personal kind of situation. So when somebody goes to a provider, unless it's something as simple as please take this splinter out, which it hardly ever is that simple, and the older you get, the less likely it is to be that simple. Usually it's a vulnerable kind of experience. So for that reason also, the relationships between patients and providers really matter. So all of these matter, but I also want to just point out that I've kind of done something in describing this, broad demographic, kind of differences, and then also social institution, and then also expertise, and then also personal vulnerability. That kind of context of looking at different layers of why things matter and different layers of what might be going on, that's really an approach, you might call it a contextual approach, that a lot of people in our psych department use. Not that very one, but the idea of a contextualized understanding really characterizes our work. So we do focus groups to really hear from people to understand things at these different levels. So that's the gist of it. I'm open for questions. Thank you.
Aloha kako, kumusta kayo, amen. Hi everyone, I'm Alma Trinidad. I'm a social welfare scholar. I earned my Bachelor of Social Work degree from University of Hawaii at Manoa. I also got my master's degree from University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, and then I earned my doctorate at University of Washington in Seattle. Before I go on to kind of tell you about a little bit about my trajectory and then some of the studies that I've embarked currently, I want to tell you that I am also first generation college student, first generation scholar. So I know a lot of the things that you may go through as you embark in this journey. But first of all, kudos to you for being accepted to this program, and I'm very excited about your journey. To me, I see research as one that would empower communities. I also see and view research as one that I need to facilitate social change and social justice. Hence, my role as a researcher, my role as an instructor, my role as a professor is not merely just to discover knowledge, but to sort of see and view knowledge as shared. But most importantly, knowledge that would, one, highlight the disparities that exist in our communities, two, utilize knowledge to push for social change and to address some of these long-standing structural discrimination and oppression. And most importantly, to elevate voices in the community, particularly voices that have been marginalized and historically excluded in the academy. Hence, a lot of my research agenda touches upon a couple things. One, bringing forth the voices of youth and young adults and how they manage or sort of pave their way through health and wellness. Second, sort of providing research as a tool for maneuvering through systems and providing voice in every step of the way. And then lastly, disseminating knowledge so that way policymakers and people who are in power can change things. Let it be, change school system, let it be change mental health systems. So so now to kind of move to some of the projects that I've done here at Portland State. One active project that I've been doing, I have a recent research contract with I Have a Dream Foundation. They're a nonprofit organization, foundation, working with the Gresham area. Gresham, for those of you who are not from Oregon, Grisham is one of the most, I guess, impoverished community of color here in Oregon. In terms of statistics, it's a community that has been dealing with high school dropout among their communities of color. Secondly, high community violence. 2 years ago, I think actually 2 summers ago, around when the school year ended, there was a shooting at one of the high schools. Simultaneously, there's been a lot of migration in and out in that community. But there's been an influx of communities of color moving in due to gentrification, due to just maybe the employment patterns. So what we saw was, I guess you can say, that community has experienced some really dire neglect from the systems, particularly education. And so this foundation is really interested in collective impact. And when we say collective impact, it's partnering up with many different types of community partners, health, education, and whatnot, to sort of address the needs of the community, but particularly with education and equity. But there's also a lot of well-being indicators that we're looking at. So the main purpose of the research, the title of the research that I'm doing with that is called Youth, Family, Participatory Empowerment Research Action Program. So the method is we're using participatory action research. We're trying to encourage parents and youth to learn about research and use research as a way to advocate for their needs. So some of the regular, I guess you can say, type of strategies we're using oral history as one way to sort of solicit ideas from the families and the youth on how the perceptions of their community, what are some of the assets of the community. The other thing that we're also looking is photo voice, and teaching the students and the families how to use photos, analyzing what's in the community, using photos as a way to sort of highlight both assets and struggles and things that are happening in the community. But most importantly, we're planning to have leadership workshops with both the youth and the families about the research project, so that way they will be equipped with the skills, not just university people like me, but the whole family and the youth, and more importantly, the community. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much for inviting me to be here today. It sounds like a really great program. So I'm honored to talk about my work. I'm Jan Heinonen. I'm an epidemiologist at Oregon Health and Science University, and I'll talk about my work in intergenerational obesity. So this is a really exciting time to be in science. Everything is turning interdisciplinary, and this is just one example. So you might have heard of fetal programming or developmental origins or early life origins of disease. Essentially, the idea is that there's maternal factors. Maternal obesity is just the example shown here. Actually alter fetal development in a way that makes the offspring more biologically susceptible to obesity and disease. And so the children grow up in childhood, adolescence, and adulthood with these characteristics, and they're more vulnerable to developing diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and so on. And so on the biology side, we're learning a lot more about how these mechanisms work, the kinds of changes that happen in the offspring. From the public health perspective, what we're moving towards is, okay, so what can we do to prevent the manifestation of these vulnerabilities at the population level? And so these are just some of the, which I'm sorry, they're kind of a little small, but these are some of the key elements that they're interested in: public health, environmental factors, providing access to nutritious food, reducing psychosocial stress, behavioral factors, and promoting healthy diets and physically active lifestyles. So perhaps we can bring the risk in this group down to the level of the children of healthy mothers. So I'll show just a couple of examples of epidemiologic research, just starting to move forward in this area. So So this graph shows, this is in adolescent girls, predicted BMI Z-score here on the y-axis, and then increasing levels of physical activity on the x-axis. So if you look at this red line, these are girls who were born heavy. They were born high birth weight. And then you compare them to, you can focus on the black line, those are girls who are born at a normal weight. So the take-home messages here are girls who are physically inactive. They were substantially higher BMI than those born with normal birth weight. But the difference really diminishes with greater levels of physical activity. This is just preliminary evidence that these types of public health interventions could help to reduce the vulnerabilities in offspring of moms who might have had unhealthy environments and were less able to live healthy lifestyles. So this is a similar study. This time it's looking at physical activity in adolescence and cardiovascular risk in young adulthood. And you're seeing sort of that same steep line. Those are, again, high birth weight females, suggesting that it's a subgroup that's really sensitive to physical activity. And it's really bringing in a life course perspective. So what happens earlier in life, has impacts later in life. Okay, so those were two examples of sort of this fetal programming mitigation idea. A second piece of my work relates to more upstream factors. So you've probably heard of food deserts, food swamps, neighborhood poverty in relation to obesity-related health. There's ongoing work in this area related to early life. This is a PhD thesis done by Anna Wentz, looking again at large babies born large. And so this is neighborhood showing increased odds of being born large with increasing neighborhood deprivations. This is the level of poverty in a neighborhood. And this holds true for almost every race group except for blacks. And this is really interesting because psychosocial stress is known to be highly predictive of fetal growth restriction to small babies. And so there's some really interesting interactions that might be involved in even these really kind of environmental upstream relationships that we can work with the biologists to understand. Okay, and I'll just the most important part here are the research staff and students. These are all epidemiology and biostatistics students. They either did help me with this work while they're students or after they graduated. And so these epidemiology and biostat skills are so important to this kind of work. So, thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Greg Townley, and I'm originally from Eastern North Carolina. I went to undergraduate school at NC State, where I had a degree in psychology and then Africana studies. Then went and did my graduate training at the University of South Carolina. I had a PhD in clinical community psychology. What that means is that I was trained both as a clinical psychologist, where I was doing individual therapy and doing skills group trainings, but I was more interested in community psychology, specifically interested in how people's physical and social environments impact their well-being. And this was specifically for people with experiences of mental illnesses like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, and also individuals with histories of homelessness. My work is really informed by advocacy and research related to this idea that people have an inherent right to be included in their communities in a variety of capacities. All people have an inherent need for a good home, right? Somewhere good to live, a job or something meaningful to do during the day, and also a friend or someone to love, right? These are things that all people need, but that not all people have the same levels of access to. And we found that people with serious mental illnesses and histories of homelessness typically have less ability to integrate fully into their communities. And so my research has been informed in a way to help address this issue. Locally, my partnerships with Cascadia Behavioral Healthcare have been really meaningful to this program of research. I worked with undergrad students a couple years ago on the Community Housing and Resident Perspectives, or CHARP study, we were calling it, where we did surveys of individuals living in housing sites all across Portland, we asked them about their neighbors, their perceptions of safety, the activities they do in their communities, their sense of community, how much they feel a sense of belonging, their symptoms. And we found that housing was certainly related to decreased hospitalizations, to increased health, but that they weren't doing as much in their communities actively as they wanted to. And they really wanted to have more of a role in their neighborhood specifically. So we're going to do a study coming up soon in the next couple of years that's funded by PSU, where we're going to be asking the same questions to neighbors in the neighborhoods and asking them, what are your perceptions of safety? Are they similar or different from people with mental illnesses? What are your levels of activity? What are your levels of belonging? What are your levels of mental health symptomatology, even if you don't have a diagnosed mental illness? We'll also be working on efforts with Cascadia to help them bridge their neighborhood, or the residents of their housing, to the broader neighborhood, and also help to combat some of these attitudes that are called NIMBYism, not in my backyard, where people have this kind of inherent distaste for living near individuals who may look different, may act differently. We'll help to combat some of those stereotypes and also work on interventions to help people bridge connections into the community through something called peer support, which is working with this idea that individuals with mental illnesses can help usher other individuals who are also in recovery from mental health challenges into the process of integrating the community. If they can work with that peer to help them locate places for meaningful activities, work, a pool to go swimming, a gym, a recreation center, that they will feel more supported in doing that than if they have to do it by themselves. Also, the national project that's funded by the National Institute on Disability and Rehabilitation Research, where we're interviewing 300 people with mental illnesses across the country to assess their levels of participation and also variables that impact that participation. Their symptomatology, their health, their race, their gender, right? As well as environmental factors. So again, things like transportation and safety and sense of community. And we're going to be comparing those to 300 individuals without mental illnesses. And this is some preliminary data. This is hot off the presses. I was literally working on these this weekend, both for this and also another conference coming up, so you're the first to see it. What do these maps show? I use a lot of geographic information systems in my research to help visualize spaces and to help assess relationships between space and well-being. This is a map. The red circles here represent levels of urbanicity. So the red spots are rural areas, the blue spots are urban areas. And we find here that people in more urban areas have a stronger sense of community, but there are no differences between individuals in their levels of participation. So they have a sense, people in urban spaces have a sense of belonging that's higher than people in rural spaces, but they don't necessarily do more activities. So we're going to continue assessing that relationship. I've also done similar work with homeless youth here in Portland at PAIR, which stands for Project Education, Arts, and Recreation, where we had people drawing maps of their communities. This was a participatory approach where they really were empowered and their voice was heard in telling us what they did rather than us assuming that we know what they're doing. And then we mapped their activities out using this method called an activity space, found that male-identified youth had larger activity spaces. Their activity spaces were more conducive to well-being than non-male-identified youth, which gives PAIR some information about which groups to best serve. And then finally, one last thing is a photo voice project, which is a theme that we've heard from Alma, and I think Don will also be talking about it. Working with Central City Concern, the Hearth Collaborative, Housing, Employment, and Recovery Together for Health, to assess individuals' experiences moving from streets to home. And here are two pictures. One, an individual's previous home that she went back to, and a poignant experience of connecting with that. And the caption she gave it was, "It misses you." And then someone else who now has a home, and he's talking about the experience in his backyard, setting up a space where he can sleep outside, but it's in his backyard, so he doesn't have to feel that he's violating or in a space that he's not allowed to be in. All right? So that's it. I'm happy to talk more. Thanks.
So I think given our time, I am going to skip my 5 minutes, but don't worry, we'll get plenty of that. And let's take some questions. What questions do we have for our fabulous panelists?
What's the most surprising thing you found so far in the diapause?
The diapause? Well, it's kind of what I was saying before is that, well, so what's a kind of a conundrum is when you arrest development, right? You shut down the metabolism, you shut down protein synthesis, the expression, right? So if you're doing that, DNA repair is an active process. You have to express genes for it. It requires energy to reverse these processes. So it's this conundrum, right, where you want to shut everything down, but you can't let your DNA go to heck, right? So most surprising is that they weren't preparing their DNA at all during diapause unless you give them this light. So that was interesting.
So when they start to reactivate, that's when it starts up again, they start to prepare their own DNA.
Well, so it appears that they rely exclusively on the enzyme photolysase, right? If you don't give them that light, then they don't repair it, which is interesting. If they're buried in the mud, right, there's not much light, because you need visible light, which is going to come from the sun, and they're buried in the mud, and they're accumulating damage, because you're imparting it, so it's a very paradoxical situation.
How come?
I just wanted to piggyback on the same question. Was there anything you can take away from maybe biomedical applications or something like that from your use of that enzyme?
So the enzyme has been known for quite a while. They've actually taken the enzyme and put it into mouse cells, and then they give it UV radiation, and then they give them light, and they find that, oh wow, they survive better given this enzyme, right? So it's interesting that humans and so placental mammals, so like humans, monkeys, we actually have lost this enzyme. We rely exclusively on the process known as dark repair. So you go outside, you get sun on your skin, right? It doesn't matter if you give visible light after. It's a completely light-independent process that we repair DNA with, right? So maybe someday, right, you can rub this enzyme on your skin that'll help reduce skin cancer, but
you said they're in anoxic states. Have you delved any more into concluding why, or are you guys still kind of just researching as?
like why they're able to do that
Yeah.
or how? Right?
Yeah.
So the why is right is because they're in the sediment and there's no oxygen down there, right? The how is a bit more complicated. So the way that they appear to do that is they so if you're familiar with mitochondria, right? So mitochondria, classic powerhouse of the cell, they require oxygen, right? So oxygen is the terminal electron acceptor. And so as electrons get passed through the electron transport chain, you have to give it something to go to, otherwise you have electrons flying everywhere and you create bad stuff, also known as reactive oxygen species, so that's a bit more kind of in the past 10 years more famous, where you want antioxidants to stop, oxidative damage, so that's really where the primary source of oxidative damage comes from. And so the problem isn't going into an oxidant, because you just shut down everything. The problem is coming out, because then you have this flood of electrons going through the electron transport chain, going everywhere and causing loss, right? So the way that they do this is they actually appear to not have this explosion of ROS. So somehow they're able to shut everything down. They stop their metabolism, they stop growing when you put them in oxida, and when they come out, they don't have this explosion of ROS. And so that's kind of where we're at right now. We're not really sure how they're shutting this down, but if we can figure out how they do that, it might help us understand how to prevent damage from heart attack and stroke.
Yeah, Chase.
Shifting gears a little, I have a question maybe for the group, the first 2 or 3 people who want to comment. There's such an array of methods and questions, and could a couple people just comment on how did it just sort of happen organically that you ended up with these questions and these methods, or how much did your personality play into those choices?
I can say that for me, the Bridges team actually matched applicants with mentors, and they took interests in personality and background into consideration when matching. It didn't mean that you would go into an internship that was in the field that you were in, but that they felt was a good match.
And with you, it seems to have worked out, even though your first reaction was, what's this project have to do with
Yeah.
it?
Yeah, it was I learned a lot about research methods from both of the internships I did, even though neither of them are actually in the field I'm interested in.
I guess for me, starting when I began entering my major as an undergrad, just being curious of a particular phenomena. And like for me, I was very interested in communities and how communities play out in someone's life, let it be health, education, and then sort of understanding some of the theories, and then just being curious of like, why this? why is that not happening in one community and happening in another? And then sort of comparing like why this racial group and this racial group have this type of treatment, and then most importantly, why are things in the policy level not happening? So just being very curious on what's happening. And then most importantly, I guess learning about the background, like doing a literature review on what has happened with that phenomena that you're interested in, and just seeing the landscape of it and creating questions that would then inform what you're curious, and then the methods sort of play out. I mean, I guess I want to also point out, as an earlier scholar, as an emerging scholar, I was very much interested in quantitative stuff, like looking at surveys, but then midway through my career, I found, look, quantitative did not, surveys didn't answer some of the things that I was curious about, like discrimination and oppression, and the way people perceive that. So then started to kind of realize, look, the voices of the communities that I served or been a part of haven't been addressed. So hence sort of moving my methods or being curious on mixed method, and then now, you know, especially qualitative and the voices of the people.
I can speak to that somewhat also. I think one of the things that Dr. Trinidad mentioned was sort of like at different points in her career, emphasizing different methods, and I think that's really quite relevant. At any given time, one can only do so much, right? Historically or classically, we say that first you start with your research question and that drives the methods and everything, right? But in real life, people have expertise that leads us to view certain things as worth asking about, right? And then sometimes we have to examine what our assumptions are that we're bringing to that work. I mean, actually, that's a really good thing to do all the time. And then when you examine those assumptions, sometimes you say, oh, wait a second, this method that I'm using doesn't fit the assumptions I actually hold. I either need to collaborate with somebody else, or I need to change my question, or I need to back up and get more training, or whatever. But I think, I think you start with some kind of training that lets you answer some kinds of questions, and then you just keep going, and you collaborate with people, you become invited to participate in things, you learn, you go on.
I know you said 2 or 3, but I just want to add 2 things. To me, the most exciting research happens when disciplines intersect. And so it's even as, physiology and public health, and there's, some linkages, but to really think about, so what is the role of my field in whatever question this other person is asking? So that's really exciting. But the second point I want to make is it's hard work. It takes a long time to become entrenched in a different field. And so patience, diligence, etc. But stay excited.
Well, and just to sort of piggyback on what Jen said just now, but also what she said earlier, that it's a really exciting time to be in science. And as a person who's in public health, I mean, the intersectionality and the interdisciplinary nature of everything that's going on, I mean, it's very clear that the solutions that we're all looking for are not going to be solved within one discipline. And that if we don't know how to converse and work together in really authentic partnership, we're not going to be getting anything done. And it's not as if that's groundbreaking information, but I think increasingly we're being forced to really to engage with scholars across these disciplinary boundaries. Yeah.
As I listened to the panel, you mentioned 3 important things. The research empowers the community, bring forth the voices of youth, also disseminate knowledge. My question is the implementation stage. How are you going to implement that after research?
Just one second. Dejanique wants to just add to that.
Yeah. So my question is really for Greg and Jan and Alma and Kurt. You guys are working in public health, and especially with Kurt saying that minorities are open with your doctors, and the research that you guys are doing and everything like that. How are you getting to that trust? Because I know like in my community and other communities, they don't trust their doctor. They don't trust people in government and things like that. So I don't know if you guys can answer this question. It's what I'm really interested in. It's like what's happening in Virginia and CAC.
Right. So these questions to me just really dovetail around, there's a lot of research that can be done on the one side, but then what do we do with those findings, which is a whole other set of research, the implementation piece. And so it sounds like that's what we want to hear a bit about.
I can start us off, and I would say that the building of trust is inherent to ever getting to the stage of things being able to be implemented. And so I always start out, and I think it's a good idea to start out with this notion of total humility and coming in with really wanting to learn from the organization about what they need and also what resources they already have to do what they're wanting to do. It could be that they are already doing what you think is this natural, new, cutting edge approach. And a lot of times you hear from them like, yeah, we've been doing that for years. Are you serious? That's still like something that's seen as innovative. And that's really humbling, right? But it also pushes you to do so much better and pushes you to ask them, okay, well, tell me, here's what I have to offer. What are your needs? And then you find some sort of middle ground. It can't be entirely led by the researcher. And although I sometimes defer and allow it to be more led by the community partner than myself, I also have to understand that I do have an expertise that they are asking for. And I can't totally surrender that, right? So if there are questions they want to ask or data collection approaches they want to use that I don't think are realistic or will allow us to answer the question, I'll step up and say, let's do this instead. And it's really this process of not just coming in and saying, hey, let's collect surveys. It's like, hey, first, I give psychology away. What can I do for you? What evaluation? What trainings can I do? I hang around. I get to know them. They get to see me and see that I'm part of the organization. And over time, then, that means that once we have results, that we can prepare reports, we can present those, and rather than just going to a drawer somewhere, which often happens, and which is really sad when that does happen, they really see the value and they want to use them, and they want to work with you to say, how can we get from this significant results statistically to having it actually be practically significant for the organization. And that again requires dialogue, requires time, and it's a long process. It's not overnight by any means. There is resistance.
Yeah. And I think if I could just add to that, I think inherent in what Greg is saying, and for those of us who do public health, psychology, social welfare, anyone who does work that also has implementation aspects to it, the trust building starts for many of us in the way that we do the research. And not to say all research is community engaged, nor should all research necessarily be community engaged, but I think many of us, I was thinking, wow, I randomly selected people for Monday and I got like a good swath of the community-based researchers up here, and I think you heard that, is that the way they approach their research is with the understanding that relationship is key to getting the most valid findings and the most useful findings, and the implementation is going to be a failure from the get-go if you don't lay that groundwork, and that groundwork isn't laid in a few meetings, right? We're talking years of engagement to help get us to the place where we can intervene in ways that are effective and long-term, and build on that trust, which is a two-way process, which takes a lot of time, as Greg was saying. Yeah. And
I wanted to add that yes, it is relationship-based. I think you also need to understand the history of some of the mistrust that has occurred. I mean, universities who've done research with communities, especially communities of color, have not had a good rep. And to sort of acknowledge that pain, that mischief, deceit that has happened, and sometimes at the get-go been harmful for communities. So to acknowledge that. Practical-wise, I work with my team all the time to sort of unpack their biases and sort of be in a community of our own, and even the community with our partners, to sort of air out some, just things like, okay, I got to work on my own biases and my stereotype about that community, even though I may look like them, but I'm not from, there's, I guess you can say, privileges, power and privilege that you will have as someone with the university title, you know what I mean? And so there's a lot of clout with that. At the same time, there's a lot of accountability and responsibility when you enter a collaboration or partnership. And it's long-term, and it's being there at the point when, even to the point like, okay, I just need A, B, C, like tools or even supplies from the university. So it's being there.
I just wanted to add, so I rely on folks like this to engage communities and really help me ask questions that are pertinent to public health. And so I just want to make a plug for this full spectrum of kind of translation where you have quantitative research that's best informed by working with collaborators who there's distinct skill sets, but they're all important.
Yeah, I appreciate, I mean, that's so true. And even with this, in this room, we're clear that we have people from all over. Carlos showed you the map, right? And so those collaborations that we're talking about, so Jan and I work on a couple different projects, or hope to be working on a couple, are writing grants together. And we hope to be raking in the money to work on these projects. And we have, very similar disciplinary training in one way, and then very different disciplinary training in other ways. Had I met Jan back when we were freshmen or sophomores, and we had 10 years, that's a generous number, 10 to 15 years to work on our language and our collaboration, like only the better, right? So the people sitting around you right now in this room, and I know this might seem a little like, but these are your colleagues and your future collaborators, and these are the people that you're going to be writing grants with and going to be doing work with. And for those of you who are sitting here thinking, I don't even know if I definitely want to do research, I get that, and that's fine. You might be in practice somewhere, right? But you might still be engaged in research in other ways, and these are your future partners. And that 700 people that Adrian was talking about around the country, those are people you're going to be connected with too. And so I think the interdisciplinary nature, our reliance on each other, just can't really be understated.
Let me say one quick point.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so the part you're saying about the people around the room, I want to be able to respond to your question as well. So I think that everybody who has said there are separate skill sets involved in implementation, that is so true. And some of the people who are strongest at implementation might not be as strong in some other aspects and vice versa. So along those lines, one thing I'd like to offer as you move forward and become scientists is that it's probably better to have lots of scholars do a little bit each of sharing their findings with the people who provided their data for them than it is to have 1 or 2% of scholars doing a whole lot, right? So I think to have everybody have a little bit of that skill is really, I think, a respectful way to have it become really an institutionalized part of science. That would be my 2 cents.